Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to take another couple of minutes to allow people to log in. Hello, everyone. I'm Justin Williams. I'm Interim Director of the Black Studies Program here at the City College of New York, and I want to welcome all of you to the 43rd Langston Hughes Festival. Since 1978, this festival has proudly celebrated the preeminent Black literary talents in the world, and today we continue that proud tradition by honoring Jamaica Kincaid. When we think of someone like Jamaica Kincaid, words like trailblazer, icon, and legacy come to mind. And this symposium showcases the ongoing impact of Kincaid's works on students and two of the finest award-winning Caribbean authors working today. We are so honored to hear the insights about the influences of Miss Kincaid's work from CCNY student Rosanny Suazo and acclaimed writers Maisie Card and Naomi Jackson. And with that, I would like to hand today's forum over to your moderator, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Literature at the City College of New York, Kedon Willis.
All right, thank you so much, Justin, and thank you everyone for being here at the Langston Hughes Festival, celebrating the work of Jamaica Kincaid, one of the foundational writers of contemporary Caribbean literature. I'm very excited to have with me as well. I'll begin with one of my students. As Justin pointed out, I am assistant professor of Latin American and Caribbean literature at City College, and I specifically this semester I am looking at writings on the landscape by Caribbean authors, and Jamaica Kincaid's work on the landscape itself has been pretty eye-opening for me and my students in terms of how the land cannot be separated from the bodies of Black and Brown people historically who were moved around because of the transatlantic slave trade. So as much as we love the fruits and many of the flora that we're familiar with in the Caribbean, it too was a part of the equation in terms of being moved around. And we move from that to an understanding of how the logic of tourism in the Caribbean in our contemporary time cannot be disarticulated either from this logic of slavery and colonialism, and how it is recalibrated today in the form of tourism that still creates this dynamic of those without power and those with spending and consumer power. And the effect of some of these works, particularly from a small place in my class, was such that I had students who responded with their own works in terms of their experience with where they are from, if they are from the Caribbean, and even here in New York. So it's my pleasure to introduce one of my students, Rosanny Suazo, who will be reading the poem, The Pressure, and talking about her own relationship with her island, set of islands, New York City, and how it has changed following the COVID pandemic. Please welcome Rosanny.
Thank you so much for having me. Everyone, hello. Okay. The pressure. I knew it was probably just me, as I am roaming the streets, thinking away I couldn't defeat. I was hoping it didn't mean I was losing my feet. This world all around me, as I walked through the beats and I rolled through the heap, was a new place. A place I don't remember as a child growing up. An familiarity creeps over me. As a child, I remember I hugged strangers on the street, in the parks, sharing swings. I remember circle time in elementary. We'd all be squeezed together on a bright, colorful rug, our legs touching. No worries about getting sick with a bug. As I got older, I went to the Copacabana. I partied with adults. I danced. I remember the people, so many of them all around me dancing too. Our bodies on the floor touching, loud conversations booming. As a teenager riding the A train, I'd meet a random local who'd tell me a story, their face lighting up with emotion, kind of like the train lighting up the tunnel. Their voices over the loud bangs and drums, the train goes through its rhythm. The story a reminder, we can't tell stories like this anymore. Now all I see are their eyes, filled with feelings that cannot be fully expressed. Coughing wasn't a side eye, a conductor yelling, "Stand clear, closing doors, please." I flinch every time I hear it. I'm pondering on this crowded track in this noisy station. Where is the world turning and how fast it came to this? When did I become a tourist in the world I live in? The city has never been a small place. Though an island, the apple is a large place. I was not ready for this day where a pandemic could affect our daily lives. A foreigner to all these things, where have you been? Lost in the mass, charmed by masks, gloves, and sanitizer. I was a server for half my life, of service to a variety of people, from tourists to locals. I once shifted through tables of faces, beautiful faces who wanted a good time. I now shift through faces of fear covered in cloths, fear of breath on faces. Parties are gatherings of two having wine and pizza to pass the time. There is no work. Thank God for unemployment. It gave us hope. Better days would come, but they didn't. Quarantine, curfew, stimulus. More cases, COVID now a looming cloud over our everyday lives. Some were afraid, but many are resilient. I still had to be a mom. I still had to make sure my son had everything and more. I still saved my money. I made COVID a bad odor that lingers around the house unless you open the window and bleached and Lysol everything. But I am not afraid. Though this world seems unknown to me, it is a world I must learn from my son. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosanne. And I'm very glad you chose to participate today. I'm so happy to see how far your work has come. And I hope this is a testament to how a writer like Jamaica Kincaid, who started writing in the 1970s, continues to have this impact on writers in New York, in the Caribbean, in the diaspora. And so that is going to be my segue into talking about our esteemed guests today. First, we have Maisie Card, who is the author of the novel These Ghosts Are Family, which won an American Book Award, the 2021 OCM Booker's Prize in Fiction, and was a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award for Debut Novel, the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and the LA Times Book Prizes Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review's The Daily, in Agni, the New York Times, Guernica, and other publications. Maisie was born in Portmore, Jamaica, my hometown, but was raised in Queens, New York. She is a graduate of the Brooklyn College MFA in Fiction program, and she lives in Newark, New Jersey. And we also have with us Naomi Jackson, who is the author of the novel, The Star Side of Bird Hill, which was nominated for the NAACP Image Award and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and longlisted for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, and the International Dublin Literary Award. The Black Caucus of the American Library Association named Jackson's novel an honor book for fiction. Jackson studied fiction at the Iowa I meant to say Iowa Writers Workshop. She traveled to South Africa on a Fulbright scholarship where she received an MA in creative writing from the University of Cape Town. She is the recipient of residencies and fellowships from Breadloaf, McDowell Colony, Hedgebrook, the University of Pennsylvania's Kelly Writers House, Camargo Foundation, New York Foundation of the Arts, and Bronx Council on the Arts. Jackson is currently assistant professor of English at Rutgers University, Newark. Welcome to you both. I'm so excited that you're here. I'm so excited to have representations of the dynamic voice of contemporary Caribbean literature. So my hands off to you both, first of all. I don't have anything to say before I jump into my hard-hitting questions. Okay, all right. So I want to start with a pretty open question, since we're here honoring the legacy of Jamaica Kincaid. And my question is about her legacy. How has the works of Jamaica Kincaid impacted you both as writers, but also as persons? And is there any work in particular that has been especially affecting?
I would have to say that, I was, before preparing for this, I was like thinking back to my novel and actually reading the first chapter. And I think I even took for granted how much her work influenced that first chapter. So I think stylistically, she's been a major influence on me. Specifically, I was thinking about, how I use repetition and just realizing that a lot of that, was taken from Kincaid's work, specifically in probably A Small Place. My first chapter is written in second person, which I remember being told, in the MFA that I shouldn't do. And I think just A Small Place is one of those kind of works that I just think about constantly and can remember specific lines from it. And I think the way that you was used in that essay kind of left a mark on me, and just the kind of rhythm left a mark on me. And it made me kind of realize, the power, the kind of things that you can do in literature if you can get the reader to kind of go along with this specific rhythm and follow this pattern, and how it opens up the door into being kind of subversive, in your writing. So the first chapter of my book, I repeat the phrase let's say, and we kind of jump characters in each section, and the last character is a ghost. I think I couldn't have gotten away with that if I didn't realize, if I didn't learn how to use rhythm and how to use repetition in fiction.
Right, and let me just jump in very quickly, and I have to say that that first line, which I don't have on the top of my head, but it opens with this. It just tells, let's say you are a 69-year-old man who stole someone's identity, a dead man's identity. And I had this feeling of, oh, all right, yeah, let's let's say this. And it has this wonderful effect of being both rebuke, but also enticing in a delicious, subversive way. Which, yes, if we're talking about Kincaid, I think delicious subversion is something that comes to mind pretty often. Naomi.
I have so many things to say. Ms. Kincaid is such an important writer to me. I'm going to try to do better. I think I met Jamaica for the first time in 2003. I was 22 years old and thinking I might become a writer. And I bum rushed her at a reading at Hunter College. And she's so kind. And I said something that was going on and on about our family in Antigua. And she was just listen to me bumble on. And I said, I'm going to send you my writing one day. And she said, you should. And I just thought, what a kind and generous and open response. And that's always been such a model for the way that I talk to young writers, right? To just be encouraging and to have an openness of spirit to life unfolding in whatever way it might. So Annie John is probably the book that was most important to me and continues to be. I read it for the first time when I was 10 years old, I think. And the book just, it's hard to really recount how important it is to me, both as a person, as a teacher. I think back then, even though Annie was a fictional character, she was really created a new model of Caribbean girlhood that was basically the opposite of everything that I'd grown up with. So I'm recovering people pleaser. I was even an acolyte at the time, right? So kind of a very good girl. And Annie was a delightfully bad girl, unafraid to create offense, unafraid to be herself, unafraid to say exactly what she thought. And so like even more than as a writer, I think in the very beginning when I encountered Annie John as a little girl, it just created a kind of a container for a different way of being a Caribbean girl than what I'd known before that. And so it was really foundational in terms of opening up a different space for behavior and for a relationship to the world. So that was profoundly important to me. Even in my work, I was remembering like how important, I'm sure you guys have all seen, this is the paperback of Annie John, and there's that little schoolgirl on the cover. And I just loved her pose, right, of relaxing in her school uniform, not being afraid to dirty her school uniform, just chilling, right, in the way that the young people would say. And I really wanted to have a Black girl on the cover of my novel. That was really important to me. I'd seen this Black girl on the cover of Annie John and on the cover of Paul Marshall's Brown Girl, Brown Stones. And so when I had a chance to work on my own novel, I really insisted that we go with an image of the Black girl on the novel. And I think that has had something to do with what people appreciate about the book. In terms of the novel itself, so on page 15, which is the second chapter of The Star Side of Bird Hill, the novel is about two sisters who go home to Barbados and kind of end up upending their life in New York City and living with their grandmother. And in this chapter, the little sister, Phaedra, is sick and she's pretending to be sick. And she's reading Annie John. I want to find it because it's kind of classic. So she's reading, in my small room, I lay on my pitch pine bed, which since I was sick was made up with Sunday sheets. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. I could hear the rain as it came down the galvanized roof. The sound the rain made as it landed on the roof pressed me down in my bed, bolted me down, and I couldn't so much as lift my head if my life depended on it. And so Dion, her older sister, is actually reading the book in an attempt to like care for her. And then 2 seconds later, her older sister throws the book at her and says, "Get out of bed, you're not sick." And it's kind of like something probably would have happened with my own older sister who loved me, but wasn't afraid to just be like, "Girl, stop playing." And so I included that passage from the novel because Annie John was so foundational to me as a young person. And I wanted to just have a moment in the book where there's a character reading the book and it becomes, I think she actually hits her little sister in the chest with the book and it becomes a whole fight between them. And so anyway, so Annie John had the effect of just being kind of almost like a meditative thing that I return to almost every year as reading. And I've taught it so many times. I'm teaching it now in a writing difficult stories class at Rutgers. I've taught it in intro level creative writing courses. I've taught it to talk about the coming of age story. Just Annie John has had such an incredible impact on my life, both as a writer and as a teacher. And I would say too, strangely, I write mostly about Barbados, but I have an Antiguan passport. My dad's Antiguan. And I think in part because there was so little about Antiguan history, Annie John actually filled in a gap of understanding about what my father's childhood might have been like in Antigua in the 50s. My dad was born in, well, I won't say his actual birth date because that's weird, but around the same time as Miss Kincaid. And I had all these stories from my fathers and my uncles about their childhood, mostly in town. in Fibri. And so I had a very specific idea of what Antigua in the 50s was like. And I feel like Annie John kind of offered an alternative understanding of what Antigua might have been like in that time. So I spent most of my childhood going to Antigua in the summers, 8 to 14. And so I knew the Antigua of the 80s and 90s, but I didn't know that previous Antigua. And I think it's fair to say that there are not actually that many texts that explore Antiguan experience. Natasha Lightfoot is a friend and incredible historian of Antiguan slavery and post-emancipation. But I think that, you know, I hate when people do too much in terms of saying what fiction is meant to or has to do. But for me, it really did fill a gap beyond the novel in terms of understanding what little girls might have experienced growing up in Antigua in that time period. So yeah, I love Annie John, love Jamaica Kincaid and her work. And that book specifically was so important. Yeah.
Yeah, just oh, sorry. Just to add to that too, you know, I remember reading Annie John in 7th grade, you know, and it was just the first book that I had read by a Caribbean writer. And I think what resonated to me too was, you know, there wasn't this, I think we had probably read like Jane Eyre before that or something, you know, and there wasn't like this emphasis of like virtue and like goodness and kindness, I think, that I was used to, you know, and I think I connected to a character kind of thinking about their own needs and thinking about themselves, and also the mother-daughter relationship, and this kind of, this idea that you can be ambivalent about your family, is something that stuck with me, and that I think I still write about a lot.
With what you're both saying in terms of your encounter with Jamaica Kincaid, it was startling for me because my relationship with Caribbean literature, which happened pretty late in my life, actually. I wasn't in the Caribbean anymore when I was introduced to Caribbean literature, but then I was introduced to the stalwarts of the Windrush generation. So Derek Walcott, Sam Selvon, etc. And so that was my idea. And then I pick up Annie John. So I'm going to use it as a platform. And maybe this is going to just expand on some of what you said, but do you have a sense of how for you, Jamaica Kincaid's voice was different from other Caribbean literature you may eventually encountered, or for you, Naomi? What was so different about the voice?
I think, you know, definitely stylistically it was different for me. You know, and I didn't, you know, Annie John was the only book by a Caribbean author I read, you know, from 7th grade to 12th grade. I didn't read any more books till I was in college, you know, and kind of sought them out. But yeah, I think stylistically, they were still, they're still different. I mean, almost like poetry. I felt like, way in the way repetition and rhythm is used. But also, I think, you know, one thing that I noticed too is just that they're just, and I'm trying to say this in like a sense, it's not about like victim and victimizer. You know, I just felt like the relationships were different, and the focus, I think, was different from a lot of the books that I would read, especially in the Caribbean literature classes I took.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on something Macy said earlier in terms of like being told not to use the second person. I felt like there was a lot, and I saw an interview with Miss Kincaid where she talked about provoking discomfort in readers, right? And I think there's so many things that I think distinguish her writing from others. There's the relationship to the sentence, right? So being unafraid to write the page-long sentence that might have lots of clauses, but invites the reader to enter what's almost like a forest, right? To be challenged by the length of the sentence, to walk into the sentence and wonder what it might be when it's at that length. What might a sentence contain when it's on the page in that way? So there's that. I think that being unafraid to write these long sentences, being unafraid to do the you address, but I think also, quite frankly, in a small place, at the time, I don't think that that book was well received in Antigua in terms of people feeling really pissed off about Jamaica saying, here's where the government goes wrong, right? I don't think that there's anybody who gets off easily in that book. And I think that Ms. Kincaid takes the North American tourist to task, but she also takes the Antiguan government to task in a very direct and forthright way. And I think that it's not necessarily a stylistic choice, but I hadn't seen Caribbean writers going toe-to-toe with governmental leaders in that way. And that was informative for me, like in terms of saying that a writer does not have to be like doesn't have to kowtow to the politicians of the country that they were born in, and can be directly oppositional in ways that could lay open the truth, right? And I think the frankness, right, to say things that people were really uncomfortable with saying, to write about HIV and AIDS, to write about queer life in Antigua, like just there were so many places in which I think Ms. Kincaid has been unafraid to do things that make people deeply uncomfortable and piss people off. I think I think the reason why a lot of writers are endangered all over the world is because we're disruptive, right? We say a lot of things people don't want to hear. And in the process can endanger ourselves and other people. But I think that that's what we have to do, right? And I think seeing Ms. Kincaid do that was really inspirational to me in terms of not feeling like anything had to be off, quote unquote, off the table, right?
Yeah. Oh, did you have anything to add, Maisie, or should I?
You could go ahead.
Yeah, so speaking of that forthrightness, and that in some cases, bluntness, there's this bluntness and tenderness that happens when I read a Jamaica Kincaid sentence. But certainly what was disorienting for me is that relationship between that stage of girlhood, going through girlhood, and having that relationship with the mother that can be both redemptive and stifling. And there are lines in there, for me, when one says bluntly, I'm paraphrasing very poorly, but my mother could kill me and love me. Or this idea of undoing of the mother, that was pretty stark. I felt like, am I betraying my own mother by finding this delicious? And as I was reading The Star Side of Bird Hill, Naomi, I realized that here again, I'm being introduced to this contest between generations of women in a Bayesian context. I saw where relationships between mother and daughter was both fragile and tense and falling apart, but also how it was being built in other ways too. There was always this push and pull. And so my question for you is, where is that tension coming from for you in creating this book, in writing this book? The Star Side of Bird Hill.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think Annie John really, I want to say one more thing about the inheritance of Kincaid. And I think that's about introducing feeling, like an intensity of feeling, as a deeply important place to explore in Caribbean literature. And I think that's actually what also made Antiguans really angry, right? Is the sense that, like, why should we read books about someone complaining about their life and their feelings? Like, there was not a space there's a Caribbean stoicism, right? That everybody should buck up and just deal with whatever whatever cards they've been dealt, whatever family situation they've been thrown into. And I think Annie John says specifically, no, actually, I want to explore the hurt. I want to explore the difficulty of having one mother one day and then being thrust into this young womanhood that means I lose this intimacy and love that I had with my mother before, right? And saying that's actually worthy of a deep and profound exploration. I think that's a big inheritance that Kincaid offered to me specifically, and offered to the entire generation of Caribbean writers who's writing alongside me. So I think, I have a very complex relationship with my own mother, but I grew up in the States where people were like always valorizing, like, I love my mama. I talk to my mama every day. Just this very intense, close mother relationship. And I was like, look, that is not my situation. It has never been. And so when I read Annie John, I was like, oh, somebody else with a really messed up relationship with their mother. And so it gave me space to talk about that and to write my way into the difficulty. And I think autobiography of my mother and Lucy both also further that opening up of space. And so, I wrote some notes, but I was thinking about like different kinds of mothers other than this kind of valorized model. Mothers who were disappointments to themselves, mothers who were disappointments to their children, mothers who tried and failed, girls who tried and failed to love their mothers, right? I just felt like Annie John opened up so much space to explore the complexity of a mother-daughter relationship that wasn't just like, you put me in the world, we love each other, the end, right? There was so much space that opened up for a complexity of feeling without necessarily saying, I'm never going to relate to you again, right? And that's what's, I think, interesting, right? It's not to say that because we have these difficult relationships, our relationships with our mothers end, but they're just infinitely complex and deep and challenging and maybe intractably irritating also, because they just go on and on and on. I think even in death, like the difficulty of those relationships can actually persist. And so I think that's what Annie John opened up for me in terms of thinking about Starside. And Starside, I'm just thinking about like, okay, how does a mother's mental health difficulties, how do the repercussions of that kind of ricochet throughout a family? What's the effect on her daughters? How does her own mother experience that as a certain kind of failure? How does her own mother maybe not want to take on her two children? Like we always assume grandmothers, okay, they'll just step in. What if you move on and not wanted to parent children in your 60s? Like that's a really challenging thing to suddenly be thrust back into that role. So I think in my novel, I was thinking about trying to actually have the mother off scene, but trying to have everybody relating to the difficulty of her difficulty, if that makes sense, and how that affects their lives. So yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to jump off something that Naomi was saying, because yeah, I think that was what stuck with me about Annie John specifically, like reading it in 7th grade in particular. It was exactly when my mother was making the shift from, being gentle with me and then feeling like her job was to prepare me, for how harsh the world was going to be by being extremely harsh. So yeah, like I just related to everything going on in that book, on a different level. And I think I did notice, and I like the way you put it too, just like the valorization of the mother-daughter relationship in American culture. It felt like, I think at that time, it felt like something I couldn't like articulate because people seem to have these kind of different relationships with their, their mother. But yeah, the mother in Annie John and also the mother in Girl, the voices were so familiar to me. And I think I tried to capture that kind of complexity, in my novel.
Yeah, Macy, I don't know if you had this experience too with your own mother, but it was not just like preparing you to be a woman, but like, it's now time for me to prepare you to be a wife, right? And so everything was organized around, this is how you might cook for your husband. this is how you might get ready to do the laundry. And I was like, wait, what? What if I wanted other things?
Yeah. Yeah. Like
Right.
a way that my mother would kind of chastise me is that if I didn't want to do something, she'd say, nobody's ever going to marry you. You know, it's like if I don't clean the house, if I don't learn how to cook, you know, that around 7th grade is kind of when that all started. So.
Could you, either of you, and perhaps you've already spoken about this, but now I'm curious because you brought up girl, and for me, who reads it in terms of my gender identity and expression as something that is foreign for the most part to me, but there was this feeling of an impossibility. I remember reading it because there is this extreme repression of any idea of sexuality going through. I mean, it is the censure throughout, this idea of do not be a slut. And then it ends on this note of, but you don't know how to attract a man. I don't understand. You don't know how to be sexual. You know, these two, it just weaves itself through this story. And I'm wondering for you both, is that tension in that story, did it find expression in your works? Did it find expression in your own lives?
I mean, definitely in my life. I think a little more, but yeah, I mean, I recognize, you know, as I said, like, you know, around a certain age, like when this like policing of the body kind of starts, you know, when my mother's whole mission became like to making sure I don't get pregnant, you know, and all of a sudden how I could relate to men, how I could talk to men completely changed. You know, and it just continued, and now, you know, until I was in my 30s, and then it's like, why aren't you pregnant yet? You know, and that always felt like a very kind of Caribbean mother thing, or like a specific fear, you know, that my parents just had, and just completely occupied their lives, just protecting me from being a slut, or, you know, acting in an improper way toward men.
And we see that front and center, I believe, in These Gold Star Family when we meet. The moment we're introduced to Karen and Vera, how they're navigating this idea of what it means to be a proper girl or a proper wife, and how would they express it in different contexts. So if Jamaica is so great, why aren't you back here? So as you know, I'm a bad girl, I'm a slut, and I need to go back to Jamaica to learn something. Why aren't you back there? What's going on? What's the backstory there? But something that also pulled me in immediately with the novel is the movement and the pace. We move from we move through time periods back and forth very quickly. We're hearing from different people in different times. They even express themselves in different narrative perspectives. We open with the you perspective. We shift to the third person. We even shift to the plural first person at one point as we move throughout the novel. And so it feels very postmodern. And something I was contending with now, and my question to you is, given the nature of what you are writing about, and I think you can explain to the audience ultimately what your book was about, given the nature of what you were writing about, did these aesthetics naturally come? How did the form of your novel come about? Was it inevitable that it would be this way, or is it something you had to carefully plot out?
You know, it took a really long time to form. I was in that book for 12 years. But you know, and it kept transforming, you know, I kept revising, and you know, the direction I was going in kept changing. But when I met my agent, my book was actually just half finished, like about half finished. And my agent suggested that, and for people who haven't read it, these ghosts are family. It's kind of like a family saga. It begins with a character named Stanford Solomon revealing to his daughters that he actually faked his own death and assumed another person's identity, but his actual name is Abel Paisley. And so the rest of the book is kind of, it's sort of circling around Abel Paisley and the people who are related to him, and focused on the kind of consequences of his decision, and looking at, secrets throughout the family over time, over a course of, a couple hundred years. So when I met my agent, she suggested I make a family tree for the book. I didn't have one, and I started making one, and then I kind of realized that it kind of looked the way that, most family sagas look, the family trees, like they're complete, they're somehow, you're able to kind of go back generations to figure out what happened. And then I realized that I wanted it to look like my family tree. I wanted it to reflect, the difficulty of piecing together your family lineage when you are, a descendant of slaves, and specifically when you're Caribbean too, when you're from the West Indies. And not just because of the lack of records, but also because of the misinformation that your family itself has come up with, kind of to cover up, on things that are too unpleasant to talk about. So I wanted the structure of the book to kind of reflect my experience of learning about family history and puzzling, together that family history. And so, as I kept writing after I made that tree, I intentionally made that decision to kind of jump back and forth in time, and to use different documents, and to use diary entries, and to have different characters. I kind of wanted the reader to feel like they were kind of just popping into the family at different points in time.
Yeah, Maisie, I have to, oh, sorry. May I interject for a moment? I was just gonna say, I talked to a friend of mine who's reading your novel, and we were talking about how it felt like just being let in on family secrets, and like hanging out with aunties in the kitchen and overhearing pieces of it. It was juicy in that way, but I think that the way you talk about the form of it makes sense in terms of the dipping in and out. And I'm so glad, because I've been waiting to hear the answer to that question of how the form.
But I feel like that's really on point too, because that is how I learned about, my family, is just like listening from when I was little to people tell these stories that I wasn't supposed to hear or understand, and not realizing that I'm like internalizing it. I'm going to hold it inside me and then listen to somebody else's story and kind of put those two together to kind of get the truth. So that's interesting that somebody commented on that.
In both, speaking of juiciness, in both your stories, in both your novels, there is the sense of what I like to say, the dopey that's about the place, or the idea of the supernatural. And I can go back to Kincaid, thinking about the idea of the supernatural not being supernatural. There's a reclamation of religious practices and traditions that from a North American perspective might be seen as superstitious or odd or different, but there's this self-evidence to it. And so I'm reading both your works, and I'm seeing where the supernatural, there is this conversation around the supernatural. Either things are just happening, or there is a conversation happening about why do you think this is crazy and that other thing is, or why do you think me going to church is incompatible with the roots I create and the herbs I mix together to help people. So for you both, I was very curious, where how did the supernatural figure in your works? Was it something very organic to the nature of what you were writing about because it was organic to your upbringing? Or was there a determination before you wrote that you were going to make a acclaim for the darkest stories and the supernatural aspect of Caribbean lives?
I think for me, it started as something organic. I think it was just something I grew up with. And, I was thinking of Annie John too, remembering, Annie, it begins with kind of her obsession with death, and also her thinking about her looking at a cemetery and also thinking about the supernatural, and I think it started out as something very organic, but then it became a way for me to kind of unify all the different stories in the book, using ghosts as a metaphor for trauma. But because when I looked back at what I had written, I saw that like the supernatural was just, it just came up because it comes up, in my family in a very casual way, and it's something that I realize if you're writing to Caribbean people, like it's something that you don't need to explain, and that was important to me in the book too.
Yeah, I think I only realized as I was teaching Annie John and rereading about Matches, I was like, oh, I think Matches prefigured the character Hyacinth in my novel, who's a obeah woman, community midwife, roots worker. She does it all, right? And I think when I was thinking about this novel, I was thinking about how to present a Caribbean person who was as comfortable in church as they were in with African-based spirituality, right? And I think that I knew so many people in my family who moved between those two worlds pretty much just because that's how they lived and that's how their ancestors had lived. And so it wasn't that complicated for them. And so I wanted to present someone who was living in that way, just like borrowing from whatever traditions made sense for whatever moment. And not feeling a lot of shame also around having to hide this sort of backwards African spirituality. Also, I just think for, like Maisie said, for a lot of Caribbean people, the supernatural is just such a part of their life. My grandmothers all would talk about, I want you to bury me in this dress, and this is the hat, and this is the hymn I want y'all to sing. I don't know that other people are so obsessed with death in such an intense way and talk to children about it. People are always asking me, what did you dream? And someone always has a dream book. People, oh, this means you're pregnant. This means someone's gonna die. This means, like that is just so much a part of how we are as people, that I think you can't write about Caribbean people and not have that be a part of how they're experiencing the world, because it's always there, like people are always trying to read the signs, and reading the signs is not about Christianity, even though people would profess that to be the center of their lives. There's a whole lot else that is also very much a part of, if you think of religion as a way of life, I think that there is a kind of superstition and interest in the occult and in duppies that is just so much of a part of who we are. Yeah.
Jamaica Kincaid, and I'm thinking of the autobiography of my mother, for instance, where there is this reckoning with the past and trying to, there's this genealogical aspect to it, right? This mother who was there and trying to trace down this ancestry and what does it mean to figure out where you're coming from and what is your past. So I have this one final question I thought of as you both were talking. And I have to say, first of all, reading both your novels back to back was an intense emotional journey. And I have my ideas, the things I want to say. But for both of you, looking back on your novels, going back into history and getting to some root of your ancestry, like really trying to grapple with your ancestry. Is it, as far as you're concerned, is it something in your novel? Is it something liberatory? Does it ultimately free you? Or boy, does it mess with you? Like, what do you think is the energy? What's the takeaway for you?
You mean writing about ancestry, or?
Or if you think back on your novel and what happens to the characters ultimately, and they're coming to terms with history and their histories and where they're coming from. Is it ultimately something liberatory, or it's damning all over again?
I think
Go.
it's, I think when I wrote, and I don't know, like, stop me if I'm not answering the question correctly, but I think when I wrote the book, my intention was to kind of fill a hole, because there were so many questions and so few answers. I thought I could write this, imaginary family history, to kind of compensate what's obviously been lost in, with time. But I think I did find it like liberating, because I think it did inspire me to actually do the work to kind of try to figure out more about my family and figure out kind of more secrets about my family. I think specifically why I wrote it was that I think my grandfather was sick at the time. He had started to show early signs of dementia. And so he was kind of the inspiration for the Abel Paisley character. And I kind of just wrote it as a way to accept the things that I wouldn't know. But I think, in writing it, it made me kind of want to push harder to kind of not just be ambivalent, about my family relationships, and kind of, do the work of trying to understand people, and trying to understand history, and trying to understand how their family relationships kind of made them who they are. I think it's been better for me in a way. It's been
okay.
Yeah, I was thinking like the liberatory or damning. I was like, could it be both? I mean, I don't know. I feel like the more I know about my family, my family is not entirely populated by angels, right? Like, we have lots of kinds of characters, in and out of, well, I won't go there. I will just say we'll have lots of characters, full stop. I know we don't need to go deeply into my genealogy, but I'll just say that I'm inspired, interested, and sometimes really perplexed by the decisions that my ancestors have made and the people from whom I'm descended. So I don't know that I could say it was either or, but I don't know that all of it points into the direction of liberation. I think some of it scares me, right?
Yeah.
What I've to know about who the people perceive me.
Yeah, I think that's and this is a journey my students are going on, particularly those who are of Caribbean descent. There's this sense of having read Jamaica Kincaid and other contemporary Caribbean writers like yourselves, this sense of, oh, it's not as easy as just saying it's all their fault. It's, they have a lot to do with it, but there is also some local forms, their histories and local forms of oppression that complicate this entire thing. So that stark looking into history is, I completely agree, Naomi. It's a sense of, well, you can't exactly map out emotionally either or, but at least there's this sense of, at least with this what, know what, I suppose. All right, I don't, because Naomi, I know that you read a passage from your novel that was citing Annie John. Is there something else you wanted to share in terms of a passage that has stood out for you from Kincaid's work, and the same to you, Maisie?
I have to look at the recently marked up copy of Annie John. I have several going. There's one in Newark, there's one here, there's two here, but yeah. I think I might read from A Long Rain. I think there was something, I've talked with my students about how I think there's a way that you write about a deep sadness without talking about clinical depression in this way, right? And having an entry point into difficulty and kind of seasons of our life in which we might go down in a way and come out on the other side different and restored. And I think along the Long Rain was that for me. So I'll just read a little bit before the section that I read. It's on page 108 if anybody is reading along. For over a year, no rain fell. There was nothing unusual about that. Drought was such a big part of our life that no one would even make a comment on it. Then each day for a week or so, the clouds overhead turned black. No rain came right away with the black clouds, but then one day it started to drizzle, first in that annoying way of a drizzle where it stings your face and your hands and your feet. That went on for a few days when suddenly the rain started to come down in a heavy torrent. The rain went on in this way for over 3 months. By the end of it, the sea had risen and what used to be dry land was covered with water and crabs lived there. In spite of what everyone said, the sea never did go back to the way it had been. And what a great conversation piece it made to try and remember what used to be there, where the sea now stretched to. Yeah.
I wanted to read about, I actually wanted to read from an essay of Kincaid's. It's called Those Words That Echo Through Life. How do I write? Why do I write? What do I write? This is what I am writing. I'm writing Mr. Potter. It begins in this way. This is the first sentence. Mr. Potter was my father. My father's name was Mr. Potter. So much went into that one sentence. Much happened before I settled on those 11 words. Walking up and down in the little room in which I write, sitting down and then getting up out of the chair that is in the little room in which I write. I wanted to go to the bathroom. In the bathroom, Mr. Potter vanished from my mind. I examined the tiles on the floor in front of me and found them ugly, worn out. I looked at the faucet and the sink in front of me, but not too closely. I did not examine those. I flushed the toilet and thought, will the plumbing now just back up? Does the septic need pumping? Should I call Mr. A. Aaron? But Mr. A. Aaron's name is not that at all. His real name is something quite far from that. His real name is something like Mr. Christian or Mr. Zenith, though I cannot remember exactly. He only calls himself A. Aaron so he can be the first listing in the telephone book under the heading Septic Tanks and Systems Cleaning. I come back and look at Mr. Potter. Mr. Potter, I write, and I put clothes on him, even though I do not see him naked, for he was my father, and just now he is not yet born. He is a young man, and I am not yet born. Oh, I believe I am seeing him as a little boy. As a little boy, he has clothes, but he has not shoes. I do not place him in shoes until he is. I have not decided when exactly I shall allow him to wear shoes. I could go on, but I know we're just supposed to read a short passage.
No, thank you both very much. Thank you for the privilege of this conversation, talking about Jamaica Kincaid, how trailblazing she was at the time in terms of her voice, her ideas, what she dared us to write and think about as Caribbean authors and thinkers. And of course, talking about your works as well, which are now on my syllabi, just so you know. And I think now that we have just heard the words of Jamaica Kincaid, it's my honor to welcome Ms. Kincaid to the panel to share a few thoughts or ideas or just closing remarks.
Can I speak now? Is it? This is, well, it's a great honor. I'm to to hear you speak of me in this way. You began by saying legacy, and I thought, wait a minute, I'm not dead yet. And I had no idea that what I had written made any difference to anyone. It is a very nice, isn't the word? It's an amazing thing to hear, because I absolutely never believe anyone would read anything I write, but that wouldn't stop me from writing it. But you know, many things you said, I think Maisie said not reading Caribbean writers. And when I hear you say that you read Annie John when you were 7 or 7th grade, I think, wow, even then there still weren't, we weren't known. But I grew up, of course, not knowing anything about Caribbean literature. It's not something that was exposed to us. In fact, early on when when I just started to write and I met Derek Walcott, he sensibly asked me how, if I had read Caribbean writers, and I just said no. And he said, I'll send you a book, a collection. And he did. And they were all men of that generation. And I think that that's something that's completely changed since not because of me at all. It's just something that's happened, that the writing from the Caribbean for a long time now started with, not started, but came from a lot of us women, the voices of young women, and what their lives were like. The other thing that is wonderful is that we are not interested in this idea of make-believe. We're not interested in, I overheard a little conversation on the subway, and I'll make a novel out of it, that we have the real substance of things to chronicle, and that we are not interested in the shape of the novel or the tradition of the novel or what a poem is or what an essay is, that we are simply interested in writing, in speaking, and in being truthful. Truth is a form of style, really. You don't have to invent and manipulate. The truth has its own style and its own reality. Some of, depending on that, as much as I do, makes some of my work difficult for people to read. Mr. Potter, for instance, or See Now Then, my last novel, because it depends on saying something, in me saying something truthfully. But the way I speak truthfully is not the everyday. It's something I hear, and I depend on the reality of our common history. We write very much out of history, I think, because, well, our history, the truth of our existence is not represented even in the history books. I was reading a historiography of the British West Indies by, oh, I wish I could remember her name, a very wonderful scholar at the University of the West Indies. I realized in reading it that a West Indian was not, until 1834, was not someone who looked like me. It was a white person. It was sort of a revelation the West Indian. I don't have any prepared remarks. I'm just very giddy with the conversation of these two beautiful women. Naomi has blossomed into I hope it's all right to say that. You've just become so even more beautiful. You always were beautiful, but I could hardly believe you are just this wonderful petals, hibiscus-like, to be a cliche. So it was wonderful to see you, but it's great to hear you you all talk about these things. One of the ideas in the West for us as from the English-speaking West Indies, I can only speak of that, is there's a great deal of shame directed at us. And I think in a lot of ways, it's kept us from participating in the world the way you two are doing. In my case, I had to leave home and change my name so I could escape the shame of being myself. And of course, if you're ashamed, you lie. And it is one thing I early on decided never to do, is to lie, because I find when I lie, I can't think straight. It's when I'm looking at things clearly without fear that I can understand them well. So that piece you read about me writing Mr. Potter, which is such an old piece I just wrote for the New York Times and just sort of a throwaway piece. But looking at it, hearing you read it, I thought, oh, that is so interesting how I was thinking that I couldn't put clothes on this character. What clothes would I put on him? And I couldn't see him naked because he's my father. I'm not supposed to look at my father naked because I might laugh and that might make me turn black, even though I am already black. You see where I'm going with this? Ham and Kushites. Anyway, it is wonderful to see so many women. You make me, I have to say, a little jealous because you're so young. By the way, you are young and beautiful. Youth is beautiful. Enjoy it right now. You get older and it doesn't matter what people say about age and women. Everybody, when they're old, are not beautiful. They just are alive. So please enjoy your youth and your beauty. But there was something else. Yes, history, the history. You know, most people think of well, certainly the triumphant think of history as a series of events in the past. But for us, history is one long present moment. So 1492 and 2022 are the same continuing, you know, hum, really. And it's that notion of time, you see, that we are obliged to subvert and remind the people who think history is the past and so therefore forgettable. We are obligated to say it is not the past, it is the present in somewhat, the past is the present in somewhat different form. I want to thank you both, all of you really, but especially Maisie and Naomi for your graciousness really and kindness in reading me and considering me in any way important in your thoughts. By your thoughts, I mean your writing thoughts. I am deeply honored, really beyond anything I could tell you, and never dreamt for a moment that I would be important to such intelligent and beautiful people. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I want to thank everyone for watching today's day symposium. It was such a wonderfully rich discussion by Kedon Willis, Maisie Card, and Naomi Jackson, and it really shows the power of writing and inspiration. I was inspired just listening to all of you. It's really great. I also want to thank CCNY student Rosanne Suazo for your reading of Ms. Kincaid's work. And of course, many thanks to tonight's honoree, Jamaica Kincaid. Thank you so much for joining us during the day as well.
Thank you. I'll see you later.
Absolutely. For everyone else, please come back at 6 p.m. Eastern time for our evening ceremony, where Ms. Kincaid and her works will be honored by a magnificent lineup of notable writers, artists, and scholars. See you all then. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.